He woke before sunrise. The house was quiet. The floor was cold under his feet. The house was not large. 2 rooms, wooden walls, a narrow porch. But it was his. At least, he believed it was. He had worked 16 years for it. Carpentry, railway sheds, church repairs, cash when possible, credit when necessary. The bank had said yes. That mattered. A stamped paper, a handshake, a promise. In towns like this, promises carried weight. The year was 1893, but no one said that out loud yet. Time only becomes history later. On that morning, nothing looked broken. Children still slept. A kettle waited on the stove. A coat hung by the door. Outside, the street was quiet, too quiet. He noticed it when he stepped onto the porch. No wagons, no early deliveries, no familiar voices. The bank stood 3 blocks away. Brick, respectable, painted signs, American flags on holidays. It had never failed anyone. That's what people said. In March of that year, the Chicago Tribune reassured readers that local banks remained sound, even as railroads failed across the country. The words were calm, confident, measured. Confidence spreads faster than truth. Across the nation, railroads were collapsing. Overbuilt, over-leveraged, financed by easy credit, promised profits that never arrived. But those failures felt distant. Numbers on a page, headlines far away. This town did not run railroads. It built homes, it repaired tools, it trusted paper. The man buttoned his coat. He kissed his sleeping wife on the forehead. He stepped down the porch steps. At the corner, another man stood, then another. They did not speak. They were all facing the same direction. The bank. The doors were closed. That alone meant nothing. Sometimes the clerk was late. Sometimes there were delays. But the sign in the window was new. Temporary closure. No explanation, no signature, no date. Just paper. Just ink. Someone tried the handle. It did not move. A woman arrived with her passbook. She asked a question. No one answered. A boy ran down the street. He carried a message. He said his father sent him. The message was simple. Is it true? No one knew. By noon the street was full. Not loud, not angry. Quiet. Quiet is what comes before panic. Newspapers would later describe scenes like this across the country. The New York Times reported in May 1893 that banks in multiple states had suspended operations without notice, leaving depositors standing outside locked doors. The article did not list names. It listed consequences. The man went home. He told his wife what he saw. She said the bank would reopen. Banks always reopened. They ate lunch, bread, coffee, silence. That afternoon, a notice arrived. Folded, official. It stated that payments were due immediately. The mortgage contract allowed it. Few people had read that clause. The contract was legal. The outcome was devastating. Court records from Ohio and Indiana in 1893 show thousands of foreclosures filed within weeks of bank suspensions. Not months, weeks. The man walked back to the bank. The sign was gone. The door remained closed. A sheriff stood nearby. He said nothing. He did not need to. That night, the house felt different, smaller, temporary. Ownership is a feeling before it is a fact. Across the United States, confidence was collapsing faster than currency. The federal government was bound to the gold standard. Gold reserves were draining. Credit tightened overnight. The San Francisco Call warned in April 1893 that the panic spreads not by rumor, but by withdrawal, as citizens rushed to pull savings from institutions that no longer had cash. Cash did not disappear. It concentrated. Those without it waited. Those with it survived. The next morning, the man returned to work. The foreman was gone. The shop was closed. A note hung on the door. Operations suspended. Suspended was a polite word. It meant finished. By the end of that week, 3 banks in the county had failed. Local papers printed the notices in small type. No photographs, no names. Shame does not like attention. The man sold his tools. then his spare furniture, then the extra stove. Still, the debt remained. The mortgage did not care about panic. The law did not pause. An eviction notice arrived. It gave a date. It gave no mercy. According to county court dockets preserved in the Library of Congress, evictions during the Panic of 1893 increased sharply in industrial towns, often executed within days of default. The house began to empty. The walls showed marks where furniture had been. The children asked questions. The answers were thin. Neighbors avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty, out of fear. Fear spreads faster than help. On the final morning, the sheriff returned. He was polite. He followed procedure. The man handed over the keys. He did not argue. Arguing would not change paper. The Kansas City Star later described similar scenes, noting that families departed without protest, carrying what they could, leaving behind homes paid for twice over in labor. The house stood empty. For a while, then it was sold, cheap, to someone with cash. That was how the system worked. By the end of 1893, over 15,000 businesses had failed nationwide. Hundreds of banks had closed. Millions were unemployed. Those numbers came later. The man never saw them. He moved, then moved again. History would call this a panic. For him, it was simply loss. America would recover. Markets would stabilize. Laws would eventually change. But houses like his were already gone. And no newspaper ever printed his name. Long before the doors closed, the banks had learned how to sound safe. They spoke softly. They dressed well. They printed reassuring words. Trust was their product. In towns like this, banks were not marble buildings. They were neighbors. They were names everyone recognized. The banker sat in the same church pews. His children went to the same schools. His signature carried comfort. Advertisements promised stability, savings, security. In 1891, the New York Times ran notices from regional banks assuring depositors that funds are amply protected and withdrawals always honored. The language was careful, absolute. No footnotes, no warnings. The man remembered signing his mortgage. The banker explained it slowly, almost kindly. He said housing was the safest investment in America. Land never vanished. Homes always held value. That belief was everywhere. Railroad towns grew fast. Factories expanded. Jobs appeared overnight. Money followed optimism. Banks loaned aggressively. Mortgages with small down payments. Balloon clauses buried in legal text. Most borrowers never saw the danger. They did not expect danger. Why would they? Newspapers celebrated growth, not risk. The Chicago Daily News praised Western expansion in 1892, calling it the triumph of American enterprise. No mention of leverage, no mention of debt. Debt did not look like a problem. It looked like progress. Banks did not keep cash for everyone. They never had. Deposits were lent out, invested, tied to railroads, mines, speculation. As long as confidence held, it worked. When confidence cracked, it collapsed. In early 1893, whispers began. Railroad bonds faltered. Foreign investors pulled gold. The government tried to reassure markets. Words again, only words. The Wall Street Journal warned quietly in February 1893 that the strain on reserves is becoming visible, though it insisted no general panic existed. That line mattered. No panic. People believed it. The man did not withdraw his savings. Few did. Pulling money out was considered rude, almost immoral. To doubt the bank was to doubt the town. Then one bank closed, then another. Banks called these suspensions, not failures. Suspension sounded temporary. It sounded fixable. But court filings later showed that many suspended banks never reopened. Their assets were already gone. In Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, county records from 1893 show banks lending depositors money to affiliated rail ventures that collapsed weeks later. The paper survived. The people did not. Mortgages were demonstrated as obligations, not partnerships. If a bank failed, the debt did not. The man learned this only after the doors closed. He reread the contract, slowly, carefully. The clause was there. Acceleration upon default, legal, cold. The Cleveland Plain dealer reported in June 1893 that borrowers were being called upon for sums impossible to raise, even as wages disappeared. The article did not accuse anyone. It described inevitability. Inevitability comforts institutions. It destroys individuals. Neighbors began to sell, cheap, quietly. A piano here, a stove there. Entire households dissolved without sound. Banks did not advertise foreclosures. They processed them. Sheriffs enforced the law. Judges signed orders. No villain appeared. That made it worse. The man asked the banker for time. The banker was gone, replaced by a notice, replaced by procedure. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch described this absence clearly, writing that the men who approved the loans are no longer present to hear the pleas. Responsibility had moved, permanently. At night the man could not sleep, not from hunger, from calculation. What could be sold next? Who might lend help? How many days remained? The house, once solid, felt like a liability. Ownership reversed itself. It no longer protected him. It trapped him. In other towns, the pattern repeated. Michigan, Missouri, Kansas. Newspapers stopped counting individual stories. They shifted to totals. The New York Times summarized the crisis by mid-year as a general paralysis of credit. Paralysis suggests stillness. What it meant was collapse. Children were sent away. Families split. Men left town alone. Shame followed them. No relief existed yet. No safety net, no programs. Charity was informal, limited, uneven. The law was not. The man understood now. The house had never been fully his. It belonged to paper, to confidence, to a system that did not pause for human need. And the system was not finished. Not yet. The first man ran, not away, toward the bank. Someone had said the doors might open, just for an hour, just for withdrawals. That was all it took. By the time the man arrived, the line already curved around the building. Men, women, old coats, tight faces. No one spoke loudly. Loud voices attract attention. Attention attracts fear. Fear moves faster than truth. A clerk appeared behind the glass. He did not smile. He raised one hand, just one. That hand meant limits. The New York Times later described similar scenes across the Midwest, noting that depositors stood in silence, advancing inch by inch, aware that the supply behind the counter could not meet the demand before it. Silence was not calm. It was calculation. Each person watched the clock. Each person watched the hands of the clerk. When the money ended, the truth would begin. Someone fainted. Someone cursed. Someone cried. The doors closed again. This time the sign returned, suspended. The word no longer sounded temporary. The Chicago Tribune reported in July 1893 that entire towns experienced runs without disorder, a phrase meant to reassure readers that Americans were still disciplined even as their savings vanished. Discipline did not prevent ruin. The man did not reach the counter. He never would. By afternoon, rumors moved faster than wagons. Another bank, another closure, another town. People withdrew money not because they needed it, but because others were withdrawing. That is how panic works. Not through logic, through imitation. The San Francisco Call warned that confidence once shaken cannot be restored by announcement, as depositors ignored assurances and demanded cash immediately. Announcements failed. Cash spoke. Merchants stopped accepting credit. Landlords demanded payment upfront. Employers delayed wages. Trust collapsed sideways. The man returned home early. His wife had packed bags. Not to leave, just in case. Just in case became permanent. Across the country, the pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Railroad failures triggered bank failures. Bank failures froze credit. Frozen credit killed employment. Government reports later confirmed that by the end of 1893, unemployment in industrial cities had reached levels never before recorded. At the time, no one counted. Men gathered in empty lots, not to organize, to wait. Waiting felt safer than going home. The house was still theirs, for now. But the mail arrived again. Another notice, sterner. It cited default. It cited law. Court dockets from Cook County show that foreclosure filings surged sharply during the summer of 1893. Often processed in batches, names reduced to lines of ink. Efficiency replaced discretion. The man attended the hearing. It lasted minutes. No argument, no consideration. The judge followed statute. The statute followed paper. Outside, another family waited, then another. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat observed that foreclosure proceedings had become routine, stripped of drama by repetition. Routine does not lessen pain. It normalizes it. Children stopped asking questions. They learned the tone. Neighbors stopped offering help. They had none. Entire streets changed. Curtains vanished. Windows stayed dark. Vacant houses appeared like missing teeth. Banks consolidated properties. They did not occupy them. Ownership without presence. Speculators arrived with cash. They bought cheap. They waited. The man saw one of them once. Well-dressed, unhurried. Money moves slowly when it is safe. By autumn, relief rumors spread. Government intervention, reopening banks, emergency measures. Most of it was too late. The New York Times admitted quietly in October 1893 that confidence once destroyed cannot be legislated back into existence. The sentence appeared deep in the paper, not on the front page. The man packed the last of their belongings. He did not look at the walls. Looking makes leaving harder. On the morning the sheriff returned, rain fell, light, persistent. The law did not notice. He handed over the keys. Again. The house would be empty by noon. By evening, another family would stand outside a different bank, watching a different door. Panic does not end. It moves, and it had not reached its deepest point yet. The law moved faster once panic became official. Banks no longer pretended otherwise. They stopped answering questions. They sent paperwork instead. Across counties, foreclosure filings arrived in stacks. Typed, stamped, identical. Clerks worked late, not from cruelty, from volume. Court records from Illinois and Ohio show entire dockets consumed by mortgage defaults by late 1893. Hearings reduced to formalities. Justice did not pause to ask why. The man stood in line again, this time at the courthouse. He watched names called. He recognized some. Men he had worked with, women he had borrowed sugar from. Each stepped forward. Each stepped back poorer. No one argued loudly. The outcome was known. The Indianapolis Journal reported that foreclosures were being processed with mechanical regularity, a phrase meant to reassure creditors that the system still functioned. Functioning systems do not guarantee fairness. Outside, notices were posted. Public, unavoidable. They listed addresses, dates, sheriff instructions. Homes were no longer private failures. They were scheduled events. The man's address appeared one morning, printed in small type, between two others. He tore the paper down. That changed nothing. Neighbors saw it anyway. In some towns, crowds formed to block evictions. Mostly they failed. The Kansas City Journal noted that resistance was rare and brief, often dissolving when deputies arrived with court orders. The law had weight. People did not. Banks insisted they had no choice. They cited obligations, investors, contracts. Contracts are patient. People are not. The man tried to sell the house himself. No buyers. Everyone was selling. No one was buying. Those with cash waited. Prices fell further. Speculators knew this pattern well. The Chicago Tribune acknowledged that properties were being acquired at figures inconceivable 2 years prior, though it framed this as opportunity rather than loss. Perspective depends on position. The man considered staying, refusing to leave. He imagined the sheriff returning, imagined force. He left instead. Leaving felt cleaner than being removed. The night before departure, he walked through the rooms, touched the walls, counted the nails he had driven himself. Labor leaves marks. Ownership does not guarantee permanence. Across the country, families repeated this ritual. Some cried, some stayed silent. The San Francisco Examiner wrote that eviction had become a daily occurrence, no longer news unless violence followed. Violence was rare. Despair was not. Children were pulled from school. Furniture was abandoned. Entire lives reduced to wagons. Roads filled quietly, not with refugees, with Americans. The government debated solutions, gold reserves, bond issues, stability. Those words did not stop sheriffs. Relief would come later, years later. For now, the system enforced itself. The man and his family moved in with relatives, temporarily. Temporary stretched, crowded rooms, shared meals, unspoken tension. Pride dissolved first. Men who had owned homes now asked permission to stay. The New York Times described this shift indirectly, noting that extended families were absorbing the shock of foreclosure, as if human bodies were buffers. Buffers break. Some left town entirely. West, south, anywhere. The man stayed. Staying meant watching what replaced his house. Months later, he passed the property. A new owner, fresh paint. The price paid was less than half his debt. The bank recovered part of its loss. The man recovered nothing. That was considered balance. The system stabilized slowly. The damage remained. And still, the worst losses were not finished. Loss did not stop at the front door. It moved inward. When the house was gone, the job followed. When the job vanished, credit ended. When credit ended, names disappeared. Merchants closed quietly, first one day a week, then forever. The Detroit Free Press reported late in 1893 that small shop closures were accelerating, not from theft or fire, but from the absence of customers with money to spend. Absence can destroy faster than force. Main streets thinned, windows stayed dark, signs peeled. The man walked past places he once knew by sound, hammers, voices, laughter. Now there was only wind. Banks still existed on paper. Receivers took over. Assets were listed. People were not listed. County ledgers from 1893 record homes, tools, and parcels auctioned for cents on the dollar. They do not record where the former owners went. Disappearance left no paperwork. Men stopped showing up. At church, at work sites, at home. Some left notes, most did not. The Chicago Daily Tribune mentioned an increase in transient laborers of unknown origin, a polite way of describing men who had lost everything and kept moving. Movement replaced stability. The man considered leaving too. He measured the cost. Leaving required money. Staying required endurance. Both were expensive. Food grew simpler. Bread, beans, coffee without sugar. Children learned hunger without complaint. Complaint required energy. The newspapers continued counting. Businesses failed. Banks consolidated. The New York Times printed totals weekly, as if numbers could contain the damage. They could not. In some towns, charity lines formed. Churches organized meals. Pride thinned those lines. Men preferred walking all day to standing in line. The man took odd work. Fence repair, hauling, anything paid in cash. Cash mattered now. Credit was memory. Landlords demanded weekly rent, no exceptions. Eviction moved from homeowners to tenants. Court records from Pennsylvania show that rental evictions increased sharply after mortgage foreclosures peaked, as displaced families crowded into rented rooms they could not afford. Collapse travels downhill. Rooms filled. Privacy vanished. Arguments increased. So did silence. Children slept in shifts. The Boston Globe described tenements overburdened beyond capacity, but didn't name the families inside. Names were unnecessary. Illness spread, not dramatically, gradually. Doctors accepted barter. Sometimes they did not come. The man's wife grew thin, not sick, worn, where does not qualify for aid. Winter arrived early that year. Coal was expensive, wood scarcer, fires burned lower. The man counted days by meals. By winter's end, several families on the same street were gone. Not moved, gone. No forwarding address, no notice. The San Francisco Chronicle noted in early 1894 that the population appears in flux, as if movement were voluntary. Flux is not choice when options vanish. Some returned years later. Many did not. The town adjusted. It always does. New people arrived. Lower wages, different expectations. Houses filled again, not by the same hands. The man watched this quietly. He had learned not to expect restoration. History would later say the panic ended. Recovery began. For him, the cascade never fully stopped. It slowed, it settled, and it changed who he was allowed to be. There was a moment when hope still existed. It was small, brief, easy to miss. For the man, it came with a rumor, a reopening, a settlement, some relief. Rumors are lighter than facts. They travel faster. He walked again to the courthouse, not for himself, for proof. The clerk did not look up. She slid a paper across the desk. Final. That word does not invite discussion. The foreclosure had been confirmed. The property sold. The debt partially satisfied. Partially meant forever. Court abstracts from 1894 show thousands of cases marked closed, a word that implied resolution but delivered none. Closed did not mean repaired. The man felt something give way. Not anger, not fear. Wait. He stopped planning beyond the week, then beyond the day. Long-term thinking belongs to people with assets. Winter passed again. Another year followed. Work appeared sporadically, then not at all. The man's name faded from records, not erased, just unused. The New York Times printed small notices during these years. Deaths, departures, unclaimed bodies, short lines, no stories. Local papers described an increase in vagrancy arrests, a legal category broad enough to include anyone without fixed residence. Loss became criminalized. The man avoided police, avoided crowds. Visibility felt dangerous. He moved again, then again. Each move reduced what he carried. Tools first, then furniture, then memory. Eventually, there was only a coat and paper. Letters stopped arriving. Not because no one wrote, because no one knew where to send them. The man's wife took work washing clothes. Cash paid weekly. No questions asked. Pride adjusted. Children grew quickly. Not taller, older. School ended early. Work began sooner. The family unit stretched, then strained. Some families broke apart. Not dramatically, practically. One mouth less to feed, one bed freed. The Chicago Record reported quietly in 1894 that family separations had increased, often by necessity rather than choice. Necessity rarely asked permission. The man attended a funeral, a former neighbor, cause not specified. Funerals were cheaper than treatment. Grave markers were modest, sometimes temporary. Identity compresses under pressure. Once he had been a homeowner, a taxpayer, a citizen with standing. Now he was a laborer when hired, a tenant when accepted, a transient when not. The law recognized all three. It favored none. By the mid-1890s, the economy stabilized. Banks reopened, credit loosened, new mortgages were written, not for him. The system does not rewind. It replaces. The Federal Reserve Bulletin, published later, would analyze the panic of 1893 as a lesson in reserves and liquidity. It did not mention names. The man's story never reached analysis. One spring morning, he passed his old street again, almost by accident. Children played where his porch had been, different voices, different futures. The house stood solid, occupied. Ownership had returned. Not to him. He did not stop. Stopping invites comparison. That was the point of no return. Not the eviction, not the loss. The moment he realized recovery did not include him. Years later, the panic had a name. At the time, it had only consequences. The country moved forward, slowly, unevenly. Banks learned caution, then forgot it again. Laws were debated, some were passed, most arrived too late for those already gone. The New York Times would later write that the panic of 1893 had been a necessary correction, language that made collapse sound intentional. Correction does not restore what it removes. Gold reserves recovered, railroads reorganized, markets steadied, houses filled again, different owners, different contracts. The man never appeared in those stories. He did not belong to recovery. Recovery prefers aggregates. Government reports spoke of output, employment, confidence. They did not speak of identity. Census records from the late 1890s show population shifts that cannot be explained by birth or death alone. Movement without record, absence without explanation. Communities adapted. They always do. Memory faded. Not completely, just enough. Children grew up hearing fragments, stories without endings. A house once owned, a job once held, a fall never fully explained. By the early 20th century, banks advertised safety again, savings accounts, home loans, trust. The language returned. The Chicago Tribune praised new financial instruments as symbols of progress, rarely mentioning the old collapses. Progress prefers amnesia. Some reforms came eventually. Deposit insurance, mortgage standards, protections, they were built on losses that never received names. The man aged quietly. Work when available, rest when forced. He did not write memoirs. He did not testify. History does not ask everyone to speak. When he died, there was no headline, no correction, no apology, just a record, brief, final. The house he lost still stood, solid, occupied. It had survived panic. He had not. America remembered the panic as a lesson. It remembered the recovery as a success. It did not remember the people who never returned. And it moved on, quietly. Stories like this don't end with recovery. They end with silence, with people who disappear from records but not from history. If you want to understand America before it became confident, before safety nets, before guarantees, stay with Histoire, because the next story begins where trust breaks again.